I want us to start tonight with a little story. It's called the Heinz Lumber story. It was a story that was taught and has continued to be taught with UPS management teams. And as the story goes, there was an owner of a lumber company called Mr. Heinz. And Mr. Heinz was in need of an executive to promote in his business. And vying for that job were two managers who had equal experience, but one of the managers had a little bit more tenure than the person who actually got the job. Upon him hearing the news that he didn't get the job and the fact that he had been around a little bit longer, he felt like he's the one that should have got it. He came to Mr. Heinz and he wanted to know, why didn't he get the job? Well, Mr. Heinz never really answered him. What he did say is to him, did we get any lumber in that day? So that particular manager said, well, wait a few minutes, let me go out and check and I'll come back. So he came back. He said, yeah, we did get some lumber today. It arrived at 2 o'clock. Mr. Heinz then asked him a second question, well, how much lumber did we get? And the manager said, well, I got to leave. I'll come back and I'll let you know. So he left. A few minutes later, he came back. And he said, we got 3,500 board feet. Well, this type of questioning went on and on for several more rounds. And each time the person would go out and come back with one answer. So at the end of the questioning, Mr. Heinz asked the manager who didn't get the job to step next door and leave the door open, and he proceeded to call the executive who got the job. And he asked that executive the same question, did we get any lumber today? So that executive said, well, let me check and I'll get right back to you. So he came back, and as you know, the manager was sitting in the room beside him with the door open, and he said, yes, sir, we did get some lumber today. It was 3,500 board feet. There was $16,352 worth of lumber that arrived at 2 o'clock on track 6. It's stored in the 18th warehouse, and it's for the Williams job that starts in 2 weeks. This story was one story that was told to UPS management teams, and to this day, I guess it would be 38 years for me, I still remember the first time I was taught that story. And the obviously the takeaway from that story was the importance of details. And to this day, if you were to sit in an office for a UPS management person, you can hear people say, hey, listen, there was a problem last night. I need you to give me the Heinz story. And that meant, hey, go get the story and get all the details. Well, there was never a better person that knew how to take an audience and teach examples and use different ways to teach people than Jesus. And that's what I want to talk about today, examples of how Jesus taught so that we can learn. In my research on this, I came across an article that talked about different styles that Jesus taught, and I want to talk about those. And I'm going to use something that everybody is familiar with on how he did this. But basically, Jesus told stories. He told a lot of stories in the Bible, as we all know. Some you can imagine, and I want to take you back to initially when these stories were told, and I want you to think about the people that were listening to those stories. And think about what they were thinking as he made some of these comments. He also surprised people. He used hyperbole in a lot of cases. He surprised people with his answers. Somebody would ask a question and he wouldn't give them the answer that they thought they were going to get. And he was very good at that. He used memorable sayings. We do that today, but in some of his parables, and I'm going to talk about here in a minute, he used memorable sayings to really connect with the crowd and to keep the message interesting. And then he, just like the example I gave you, in a lot of cases, he used questions. When somebody asked him a question, he answered with a question. And there's actually a name for that. But he was very good at it. And the last one, he used object lessons. He took an object, made a story about it. And as you see when I give this example, that object would have been really interesting for the people that were in the audience in this object lesson. So these were 5 ways that Jesus taught. And I want to use parables as a way to experience those. And I know everyone knows what parables are. They're a short allegorical story designed to illustrate or teach truth, religious principles, and moral lessons. A statement or comment that conveys a meaning indirectly by the use of comparisons, analogies, or the like. In my research, I think in somewhere in the 40s, 46 or so different numbers that I found, but in the 40s there was that many parables that Jesus taught in the Bible. And he was really good at it. And the first one I want to talk about, and before I show this one, If you were here Wednesday night, we had Ryan give a lesson on the prodigal son, which is the one that I'm going to talk about next. So I think it's going to be okay to do that, because if you were in Sunday school the last couple months, you heard Ronnie talk about repetition. So when Ryan got up here, I wasn't worried about it, because I just figured, hey, I'll just say it's repetition. So everyone knows the story of the prodigal son. I'm not going to read it verbatim. It's from Luke 15 verses 11 through 32. And just in a nutshell, the story obviously is about a father who has two sons. One of the sons gets his inheritance. He leaves, goes to a faraway country, squanders the inheritance, or in this case, he lived a prodigal life, and as a result, he comes to the realization that he's not doing very well here and needs to go back to his father. There's a couple of verses that I'm going to point out here in a minute that show a couple lessons out of this. But when he came back to his father, as you all know, his father was extremely excited to see him. There's a verse I want to talk about that in a minute. And his brother, not so much. And they did a big feast for him. And there's a lot of learnings out of this. So let's talk about a few of them. Okay, the audience in this parable was a bunch of tax collectors and sinners. So you can imagine, with that audience, it would be a great story to tell, the prodigal son. And if you look at that, it was a well-known story and one the audience would actually identify. The father in the story is a constant, and he symbolizes God. I think everyone knows that. The younger son represented the lost person, and the older son represented the so-called righteous. And I say that tongue-in-cheek because in a minute we'll talk a little bit about that. But his reaction in the way Jesus told that story wouldn't have been the way I would have thought it would have been, being that this fellow was supposed to be the righteous believer. But the way he reacted was a little bit different. And the major theme is the restoration of a believer in fellowship with our Father. That's the major theme of the story. So let's talk about a couple of the takeaways from it. Get a little trigger happy here. Okay, God allowed the prodigal son's free will to reign. He allowed him to get his inheritance, and he left. And in Deuteronomy 30, verse 19, it talks about free will. It says, "Call heaven and earth as witness today against you that I have set before you life and death, blessings and cursings, and therefore choose life, that both you and your descendants may live." So, that speaks to the fact that God gives us free reign. He puts things in front of us, and then we decide how we're going to react with it. Being in a sinful life is a departure from God. Obviously, the prodigal son was definitely in a sinful life. Romans 1:21 talks about that, because although they knew God, which this prodigal son did, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. It's a great verse that goes with this story. The father was waiting, and this is the one I really like about this prodigal son. In a way, I kind of relate to it, because Sandy and I got baptized when I was in my 20s, started moving. I think I've told this story to a couple people, but through my career, toward the end, I kind of fell away from going to church and God. So I can really appreciate this prodigal son story. It's probably my favorite of the parables. But what I really love about this, the father was waiting eagerly. In the story itself, it talks about the father seeing the son in a far-off distance. It wasn't like he waited till he came right up to him. He saw him in the far-off distance, which is symbolized to me that he knew he was out there the whole time. He was just, so excited for the guy to come back and into a believer again. And there's a verse in Joel 2, chapter 2, verse 13. "So rend your heart and not your garments. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and all the great kindness, and he relents from doing harm." And what I think is important here, I want to talk about this for a minute, and that's the son's willingness to be his father's servant. In verse 19, if you read that story, he talks about, I've sinned and I'm going to be my father's servant. And the reason why I think it's important, Acts 26:20 talks about it, and I'm going to expound on this, but it says, "But I declared first to those in Damascus and in Jerusalem, and throughout all the region of Judea, and then to the Gentiles, that they should repent, turn to God, and do work befitting of repentance." Okay, so we always have a lot of discussion about doing works, you know. So I'm thinking about this, and then how do you differentiate that in your mind? Well, I use the 2 Ds. One is works out of duty, and one is works out of desire. And so to use a parallel that everybody would understand, if you have a yard and you love to do yard work, then you do that out of desire. You go do your yard work out of desire. If you don't like doing yard work, then you probably do it out of duty. Same thing with a woman that likes to cook. Maybe she does it out of desire. If she doesn't like to cook, she knows she has to cook for the family, so she does it out of duty. Well, works, you desire to do works. And the reason why you desire to work is because you do the things that some of us do in this church, a lot of us do in this church. That's come to all the services. We all edify each other. We go to showers for newlyweds that are coming up. We do things together. We go to Bible studies. We go eat at people's house. We all meet after Sunday services sometime to go eat. We do those things, and when you do them and you study that Bible, you have a desire to do works. It's not that you're doing it out of duty. You're doing it because you want to do it, and it makes you feel good. So there's the differentiation. And in this story right here with the prodigal son, I think he had that desire. He was showing that desire, not out of duty, but a desire to be right with God and do the things that when we do all those things I mentioned, we want to do works. Okay? The oldest brother claims to be walking in the light, yet hated his brother and actually is in darkness a little bit. But, you know, in the story, the father actually pulls him off to the side at the very end and tells him, hey, I've always been here for you. It never really goes into the afterwards, how that person reacted after that, but he makes the point that I've always been here for you. Covetousness leads to a life of unhappiness. This is a great example of it. We probably know a lot of people that have had that situation. You're never going to be happy trying to covet this things. You never can have enough things. And then lastly, one of the teaching out of this is we follow God's waiting eagerly for our return. As I said, I love that portion of it where it shows that the father was waiting, and in the distance he saw his son. The next way that Jesus taught was through the use of surprising people. Okay? And this is the story of the parable of the rich fool. And as you know, in the rich fool, a person is in the audience, stands up and asks God to tell his brother to split my inheritance. And of course, Jesus gave him an answer that he probably didn't expect, so it surprised him. And he said to him, man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you? And he said to them, take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses. And then he went on to speak about the parable of the rich fool. And basically, a lot of people probably know what that parable is, and that is there was a person who had great success with some land and some crops, and he had barns that wouldn't fit all the crops that he had. So in his mind, he was going to tear the barns down, build bigger ones, put them in there, and then kind of rest on his laurels and kind of sit back and take it easy. I think the story talks about eating and drinking merrily. But what he doesn't realize is that at that point when he gets really, really comfortable with where he's at, God speaks to him and says, and I will say to my soul, so you have many goods laid up for many years. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? So he who lays up treasure for himself is not rich toward God. So let's talk a little bit about the learnings from this one. First of all, the audience was, this is from the Bible, an innumerable multitude of people so that they trampled on one another. So you can imagine the crowd that's getting this story. There's so many people, they're actually tripping over each other. Verse 15 obviously is the key to understanding what's being taught here. And verse 15 says, and he said to them, take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses. Jesus surprises the questioner with two main learnings out of this parable. First is, do not devote your life for the accumulation of wealth. In Luke 12:20, the parable is an interesting revelation. And it says, but God said to him, fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? A few months ago, we were studying Ecclesiastes in a Bible study with Bill and Willeen. And when we came across chapter 2, verse 18 in Ecclesiastes, he came to that same realization. And we know all the things that the preacher, or in some cases Solomon, depending on if you want to say that's him, but he had a lot of gifts, but he realized that I hated all my labor in which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to a man who came after me. So here's two examples of covetousness, where you work so hard, and at the end of the day you figure out that when it's time for your soul to be rectified, who's going to take all that wealth that you've accumulated? You've actually concentrated on the wrong things. Second takeaway from this is we're not blessed by God to hoard our wealth to ourselves. We are to be a blessing in the lives of others, and we are blessed to build the kingdom of God. That's really what we're blessed for. We're not blessed to gain wealth. We're blessed for each other. In Psalm 62:10, do not trust in oppression, nor vainly hope in robbery. If riches increase, do not set your heart on them. And then the Proverbs 3:9-10 is very telling. Honor the Lord with your possessions and with the first fruits of all your increases, so your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will overflow with new wine. So very good instructions on really what our focus should be on, and it's not covetousness. The third way that Jesus taught, he crafted memorable sayings. And blind leading the blind, as I spoke earlier, you can think about it. You know, if I'm in the audience and Jesus is telling this parable, and he says, hey, the blind leading the blind, if that's the first time you heard that, you would think, what is he talking about? We kind of know what it is because we've heard it and we use it a lot to describe, probably some people that maybe are leading us that aren't very competent. But if you think about the audience that he initially taught this to, I can imagine that it really caught their interest as he says it, and it was a memorable saying. In this case, the audience was the apostles, the disciples, and a great multitude of people from all Judea, Jerusalem, and from the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon. Blind leading the blind would have been a memorable story if Jesus told it today. So what did we learn from this? Well, a little bit about the parable. It's really just two phrases, or two verses. I'm going to read it. And he spoke to a parable to them. Can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into the ditch? A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone who is perfectly trained will be like his teacher. So the two learnings out of that, the two main ones that I got, were beware of all those who are blinded to the truth yet pretend to teach it. And a common verse that everyone knows, 2 Timothy 4, verses 3-5. For a time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but according to their own desires, because they have itching ears, they will heap upon themselves teachers, and they will turn their ears away from the truth and be turned aside to fables. Boy, we're seeing a lot of that in today's world. A lot of big churches are actually, I think, going down that road. I like to say that Sandy and I have talked about this, but I like to say that in a lot of cases, we try to conform the religion to the people instead of the other way around. And that's really the way it should be. But a lot of the churches aren't like that for different reasons, whatever. Their goals may be different, but they don't teach like that. It really should be about the religion and us conforming to it. But there's a second part of this that we need to understand. If we listen to and receive their instructions, we are also blind because we do not admit to our minds the light of truth. So we're just as guilty if we're in a situation where we're listening to a false teacher. And there's ways to know how to do that. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But we're just as guilty if we're in a situation like that where we sit and each time that the church meets and we don't do some of the things that we're going to talk about here. 2 Timothy talks about what we should be doing here, and that's preach the word, be ready in season and out of season, convince, rebuke, exhort with all long-suffering and teaching. And 2 Timothy 4, verse 5, but you be watchful in all things, endure afflictions, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. And basically what that's saying is that we can't just sit back, idly and be passive in the stories and messages that we're getting. We have to be actively seeking the truth. And if you notice in this verse, the second verse, here's what happens when we do both of those things. Both instances will lead us into a ditch. Not one of the instances, but both. So listening to somebody that's false and not doing the things that we should be doing, it's going to lead us to a ditch if we just sit back and continue to listen to that. And I had a aunt and uncle that came and visited us during the summer. And I remember as a kid, they went to church. I just remember them always going to church. Whenever we'd go visit, they always went to church. And they told me about the church they went to, and I'll just suffice to say that I was a little bit taken aback about it, and I won't say what it is, but it really surprised me. They came to a service here that Luther taught on Noah's Ark. And of course, Noah's Ark is a well-known story. Probably everybody in here could recite it. But it was interesting when the service was over that they went outside, and my aunt, which I love them both dearly, made a comment about how much she had learned from that story. And I thought to myself, wow, you know, for me as a child watching them go to church all those years, and for her to say that, and it's nothing against the preaching that Luther did, but the story is pretty well known. But in her mind, because she'd been sitting in this church, I don't think she really was being taught like she should have. Just my perception. There's a couple things that go with this if you look. Psalms 7:14 through 16. Behold, the wicked brings forth iniquity. Yes, he conceives trouble and brings forth falsehood. He made a pit and dug it out, and has fallen into the ditch which he made. His trouble shall return upon his own head, and his violent dealing shall come down on his own crown. So this is a great example of somebody that's making their own ditch, and they're falling into it because they're following a blind leading the blind. And I think the part at the end that's really important to bring out here before I move on from to the next one is that, but everyone when is preached, but everyone when he is perfected shall be as his teacher. Okay, but there's a problem with that. All that the scholar can hope from his teacher is that when he is perfectly instructed, he shall be as his teacher. But if the teacher is a blind man floundering in a ditch, as Luke 6:39 speaks to, he affords but a dismal prospect for his pupils. The perfection of such teaching is certainly not desirable. Hence is why it's so important that we do the things that they talked about in Timothy, not just sit back and listen blindly to a blind teacher or a false teacher. The next one that I want to talk about is the Jesus answered questions with questions. It's the story of the Good Samaritan. I think everybody knows that. Just a brief, recount of what happened there. As we all know, there was a person who was robbed and left on the road side of a ditch, almost half dead. 3 people came up to that person. 2 of the people, we're going to talk about these people in a second, but 2 of the people just passed him, crossed over the other side of the road. One person actually helped him and actually went above and beyond and helped him. So some takeaways from that. I think before we get into the takeaways and the understandings there, I think we have to understand the Jewish social structure, because when Jesus was telling this story, he was using what's called the Socratic method. And it's defined when you ask a question and you answer the question. You get a question asked you and you answer it with a question. That's called the Socratic method. Case in point of the example I gave at the very beginning, that's the Socratic method of way of teaching. And it's a beautiful way to answer a question, because especially if you feel like maybe it's a combative audience or a person asking that question, it's hard to argue with yourself if you answer a question. And in a lot of cases, you'll answer the way the person wants you to answer, but you really can't dispute what you said yourself. But I think it's also important to understand the Jewish social structure from who they held in the highest regard, best to least best. Obviously, in this story, there's a priest and a Levite, and they were both held in high regard. Next in line was probably just the average Jews. And then the tax collectors, the outcasts, and the sinners were a group. And then Samaritans, and then it ended with the Gentiles. So if you understood, and of course that audience would have understood that at this time, but if you understood that, you kind of understand how Jesus taught this parable. And there was 4 main learnings out of it. The first one is to understand that God's intention for us is to love Him with all that we have and to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. That's one of the main teachings out of this parable. The second was to understand that our neighbors is not necessarily the person we like, but the person who is in need. Sometimes that's hard. Thirdly, it's not automatic that one who frequents God's house and knows His mercy is able to love his neighbor. Case in point, the priest and the Levite crossed over. They were obviously knew God's law, but they didn't do the right thing, and we'll talk about that. And then lastly, it's one thing to know the right thing to do, but it's another to actually do it. And in this case, two of the men did not. So let's talk a little bit about this Good Samaritan story and the questions with questions. Jesus knows the lawyer, knows the law. So He uses the Socratic method to get an answer from the person asking the question, which limits any argument that he's going to get from him. And you can kind of tell from the story, he gets a little bit full of himself because he asks another question about who's my neighbor. So I think Jesus was very smart and recognized it and used that, answer a question with a question to limit the kind of pushback. And Jesus clarifies the meaning of neighbor by using the Good Samaritan parable. I think when He asked the second time, who is my neighbor? I think He was looking to probably get a limit on the answer so that He could maybe justify in His mind who He had to help and who He didn't have to help. The thing about the story is we know nothing about the victim, whether it was rich, poor, good, bad, or righteous, sinner, but it really doesn't matter. And I say that tongue-in-cheek because in a lot of cases, in today's world, sometimes we might see somebody in need, especially if it was an example like this on the side of the road. There's probably instances where we might pass that person by that would need help. And let's say it's in a bad part of a neighborhood, but let's say it's happening in a good neighborhood where the person that's laying there is dressed nicely. We might be prejudiced and help that person versus somebody else. So I think sometimes we have to question that, and it really shouldn't matter what economic status a person has. In the story, the first two passers-by, the priest and the Levite, showed no love or compassion for the man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, who was robbed, beaten, and badly wounded. Imagine the surprise as Jesus is telling the story, and He talks about the priest and the Levite, and then He says, hey, the Samaritan, based off that social economical thing that I just read. Think about the surprise of the audience when He says, hey, it's a Samaritan who actually helped here. And so as I'm reading this, I'm trying to think to myself, really, what's the issue here why this priest wouldn't help? And really, there's no answer. But I think if you read Leviticus 21 and you know about the laws that they made for the priest, one of them was, nor shall he go near any dead bodies, nor defile himself or his father or his mother. However, that wouldn't really hold water if that excuse was used, because he could have seen the person to find out whether he was dead or not. He just chose to cross the road and didn't help him. Same thing with the Levite. Why did the Levite pass by? I don't know. Maybe the Levite thought he was a Samaritan. It doesn't really say. But it doesn't make sense that these two people who knew God's law and the audience listening to this story would think those are the ones that are going to help him. But guess what? They don't. What happens? It's important to know that the Samaritans were not well thought of. And of the three passers-by, we would assume the most likely to avoid, and I think Jesus knew this, and He was trying to make a point with the people. So who do we see in that category today? That's kind of like what I was talking about. Who do we see as the Samaritans of our world today? You can answer that for yourself. There are people who we probably see like that, or people outside these walls see like that. The Samaritan stops to help and goes above and beyond. And I think I want to end it with that as far as the Good Samaritan, because I think it's important. Sometimes we help people, but we just start. We don't finish. We don't go all the way through. We check a box that says, yeah, I helped them, but we knew they probably needed more help, but we just did enough to either make ourselves feel good or to check a box that we went to help somebody. And I think Jesus knew that, and that's why He told the story of how this person took him, put the oil in the wine, put him on his animal, took him to an inn, nursed him throughout the night, left the next morning, told the innkeeper, hey, I'll come back and pay you. To symbolize to him that it's not just enough sometimes to help somebody. He might could have bandaged his wounds on the side of the road and left him, but he didn't. He went above and beyond. And when it comes to somebody who needs help, that's the way we should be. We should go the extra step. The fifth and final way that Jesus helped teach us was He used object lessons. And this is the parable of the sower. And I think everybody knows what the parable of the sower is. As you know, there were seeds. It was dropped in 4 different types of soil, and I'm going to go through that. But, and it yielded different results, or it will yield different results. The audience in this parable was described in Mark 4, verse 1. And again, he began to teach by the sea, and a great multitude was gathered to him, so that he got into a boat, and he sat in it on the sea, and the whole multitude was on the land facing the sea. Boy, I love that image. Isn't that a great image to see? Jesus is in a boat. Instead of him, standing on the shore, he's in a boat looking at all those people. It had to be just a tremendous amount of people for him to have to feel like he had to get in a boat and get in the water where there wasn't a lot of people and see all these people. So I think the visual here is that there's a lot of people, and I think there's a reason for this too, and I'm going to talk about it in a minute, about this parable. I think it's one of the most important ones, if not the most important one, from my research and reading it. Jesus uses object lessons here to make his point. In this parable, the object is the seeds and what his audience can readily identify with, since many would have been farmers. So he's talking about this sower and these seeds. And you can imagine if your livelihood and that way you eat is based on farming, it's going to get your attention if I'm telling you a story about a sower. And right away, I got your attention. So he keeps the attention by giving a really great parable. So what are some of the learnings that came out of this? Jesus emphasized the importance to his apostles and his audience in understanding the parable of the sower. Matthew 10, 11 through 15, he charged his 12 apostles with this. Now, whatever city or town you enter, inquire who is in it, is worthy, and stay there till you go out. And when you go into the households, greet it. If the household is worthy, let the peace come upon it. But if it is not worthy, let your peace return to you. And whoever will not receive you nor hear your words, when you depart from that house or city, shake off the dust from your feet. Assuredly, I say to you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than that for that city. I think he's telling it in this parable, because we're going to talk about it in a minute. He's making a point here that you're going to come across people that aren't going to want to listen to what you have to say. Dust yourself off. Understand that not everybody's going to be receiving of what you want to teach, and move on. It's basically what he says here. But let's look at it a little bit closer and take some takeaways from this. God sows his word on all persons, not just the ones that will bear fruit. Okay, I think we all know that. So he sows his word. Now what we do with it is dependent on this parable. There's 4 different things that we might do with it. We'll talk about that. The goal for which we are saved is to persevere, to grow, to reach maturity, and to produce more fruit. I think we do a great job with most of those. I personally don't think that I do enough to produce more fruit. I think I need to work on that area. There's no doubt in my mind that I do. We are saved not only to escape divine wrath and to live forever in heaven, but to attain to the fullness of the stature of Christ, Ephesians 4:13, and to bear fruit, John 15:5. There's examples all throughout the Bible about bearing fruit. I think I fall short of it. So let's talk a little bit about this parable. The seeds, as you know, fell on 4 types of ground. The hard ground had no roots. The birds ate it before it sprouted. One set of the seeds landed on stony ground. It germinated with shallow roots. The sun comes up and it withers away the plant. The third type of ground was stony ground. It germinates with shallow roots. The sun comes up and it withers away. The other one was the hard ground. And then the third one is seeds fell among the thorns, sprouted, but were quickly choked out from competing thorns. And then the last one, the seeds fell on fertile ground, sprang up, good healthy plants, and the Bible speaks to the fact that it went 30, 60, and 100-fold growth, bearing fruit is basically what it's saying here. So look at Isaiah 55:10 and 11. It kind of talks about this a little bit. For as the rain comes down and the snow from heaven, and do not return there, but waters the earth, and makes it bring forth and bud, that it may give seed to the sower and the bread to the eater. So shall my word be that goes forth from my mouth. It shall not return to me void, but it shall accomplish what it pleases, and it shall prosper in the thing for which I sent it. Well, I think that just tells exactly what he's talking about here on that 4th type of seed, where it grows 30, 60, and 100-fold. That's what our charge is. Not to just let it lie there, but actually do more to grow more fruit. Jesus uses symbolism associating the ground in response to the acceptance of God's word. Here's my take from these 4 different soils. The hard ground portrays a person hardened by sin, hears the word, but are consumed by a worldly life which keeps the word from making an impression on them. They're not interested. They don't want anything to do with it. They're so tied up in the world that you're approaching them and it's falling on deaf ears. That's that person. Stony ground portrays a person who proclaims outwardly that their acceptance of the word, but inwardly they have not changed. And the first time trouble arises, their so-called faith disappears. Okay? There's no roots in their faith. The thorny ground portrays a person who seems to accept the word, but their interests lay in worldly treasures. And they are consumed with these competing pleasures and take no time in growing in the gospel. They have good intentions at first, but they never really focus in on the right thing. You know, I told Ronnie the last 2, the thing I love about Taylor's is we keep the main thing here. Christmas, the main thing was the main thing. The Super Bowl, the main thing was the main thing. I love this about this church. So in this case, this person didn't keep the main thing. He let other interests take his attention away from what he should have done. And the final one, the fertile ground, portrays a person who hears, understands, and receives the word, welcomes it to influence their life, strives to follow the examples the Bible teaches while bearing fruit with patience. Only soil that will achieve eternal life with our Father is that last soil. That last person that receives that word is the only one who's destined for eternal life. And 2 verses that kind of speak hand in hand with that is, but when he saw many of the Pharisees and the Sadducees coming to his baptism, he said to them, brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Therefore bear fruits worthy of repentance. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into a fire. Therefore, by their fruits you will know them. It's pretty telling. But again, I think the importance out of this, because this was the only parable where Jesus, at the end of it, made sure that the audience said, hey, listen to what I'm telling you. I mean, he was emphasizing, hear me. And then the apostles came to him and kind of were asking questions about the parable, and he told them, if you don't understand this one, you may not understand any of them. And I think it's because of the verses that we read earlier. That he knew that they were going to be going out to try to find lost souls and bear fruit. They were going to come across different people. So those were the 5 areas. So I just want to finish in conclusion with just kind of going through the summary of the learnings. So to speed it up here, I'm just going to put them all out there. So here are the summary of the learnings tonight as we conclude. Do not devote your life to the accumulation of wealth. We're not blessed by God to hoard our wealth to ourselves. We're blessed to be a blessing in the lives of others. And we are blessed to build the kingdom of God. Beware of all those who are blinded to the truth, yet pretend to teach it. If we listen to and receive their instructions, we are also blind because we do not admit into our minds the perfect light of truth. To understand that God's intention for us is to love Him with all that we have and to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. To understand that our neighbor is not necessarily the person we like, but the person who is in need. That's important. It's not automatic that one who frequents God's house and knows His mercy is able to love his neighbor. Sometimes we have to really work on that. It's one thing to know the right thing to do, but it's another to actually do it. And finally, Jesus emphasized the importance to His apostles and His audience in understanding the parable of the sower. I think personally that was one of the most important parables because of what He said. God sows His word on all persons, not just the ones that will bear fruit. The goal for which we are saved is to persevere, to grow, to reach maturity, and to produce more fruit. We are saved not only to escape divine wrath and to live forever in heaven, but to attain the fullness of the stature of Christ, Ephesians 4:13, and to bear fruit, John 15:15. So in conclusion, shortly we're going to offer an invitation for this message tonight. But I thought about the message and I said, you know, in lieu of what I talked about tonight, how can I make this go outside of these walls? Because truly, these messages that have been outstanding from all the people that have filled in as we await Ben Walker, which, by the way, I think there might be an ulterior motive on that because it makes him look a lot better when a guy like me gets up here. So, and I'm happy for him to come up here, but I really enjoyed doing this. But I think it's behooves us all to figure out what do we do with these messages when we leave here? Do we just go home and kind of just sit on them and not do anything about it? Well, I'm asking you to do something tonight that you probably, a lot of you may already do. And that's take one of these parables, take these 5 ways that Jesus identified here that I spoke to. He told stories, he surprised people, he used memorable sayings, he answered questions by asking questions, and he used object lessons. Go take some parables. There's 40-something of them. Go outside these walls, and over the next week or so, go talk to somebody in your family. Go talk to a neighbor. Go talk to somebody that may be a stranger that you don't know. And let's try to do a better job. I know that I'm going to bear fruit. I think that I stop short here because we have some great teachers, and I don't do enough with the information that I'm getting to go out and try to bear fruit. And I'm asking everybody over the course of the next week to do that. So if you're here tonight and you need prayers, then come forward. Maybe there's some here tonight that have been thinking about putting Christ on in baptism. Please come. The idea here is we're all here to edify each other. If there's a need that anybody has, I ask you please come forward as we stand and sing. We have heard